No intro music yet. No special graphic yet. But we'll get there. We'll get there. Moses Matters is what this is being called on the Messiah Matters show. And if you're watching this on TorahResource, the Torah Resource YouTube page, then we want to welcome you to our study on Parashat Noah, or the Torah reading Noah. And as I did the other day with Bereshit, I'm going to say, Rob, what do you got to say about it? Just pass it right over to you, man.
Well, hey, that's great. Well, it's our second Torah portion, right? We talked about how Bereshit goes by it covers so much material, and a week has gone by and we're already at Noah. But the Torah portion called Noah extends basically from before the flood all the way to introducing Avram, who becomes Abraham. And so that's quite an extensive period of time, and the generations are laid out for us. But there's a recurring phrase in the Hebrew, v'hakimoti et briti, and I've looked at a lot of translations say, I will establish my covenant with you. So he says it to Noah before the flood. He says, I'm going to destroy all flesh. I'm going to destroy everything that in which is the breath of life.
Right.
And here's just a footnote there, that word all, right? I'm going to destroy all flesh. I'm going to destroy everything that has the breath of life. And then there's a qualification, except I'm going to establish my covenant with you. And I suggest that the verb there is better translated, I will continue my covenant, or I will uphold my covenant with you. He tells Noah this before the flood. He tells Noah this again in chapter 9 after the flood. I am upholding my covenant with you. And where do we see that phrase next? Is not until next week's Torah portion, Lech Lecha, where God tells Abraham in chapter 17 of Genesis that I will uphold my covenant with your seed after you. That is with Isaac, the one that Sarah will bear to you. And so the reason I just wanted to go through and point those out is because there's a continuity of covenant. God is doing something within creation, and he has known the plan from the beginning. It's not a God gets frustrated and changes his mind about what he's going to do, but he, from the beginning, through Noah, he saves Noah through the flood because of a purpose that he had from before Noah was even born. And you mentioned this in our last week about the seed of the woman, right? This promise that there would be a redeemer that we know to be the Messiah. And so our parasha this week covers, or Torah portion this week covers from Noah, from before the flood, being saved through. And of course, we're introduced to Noah's three sons, one of whom is Shem. And one of our extended genealogies in our Torah portion goes from Shem all the way to Avram. And that's important because what the Bible is laying out for us is a clarity and unfolding of God's covenantal purpose. And I have to say, go ahead.
And on that note, the genealogies are so important because last week we talked about this idea of the seed, right? The promise to the woman, or technically speaking, it's actually the God's talking to the serpent, but it's the promise to the woman that her seed will come. And so now we're starting to track the line of when this seed will bruise the head of the serpent, right? So the genealogies in here are actually very important. And when we get to Abraham, right, to Avram, to Abram, we see that he's given another clue, like it's another puzzle piece to this prophecy of, in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, and one of my it might sound silly, but one of my favorite verses in the whole Torah is tucked. It's a single verse at the very end of Genesis 11. So right at the very end of our Torah portion this week is 11 verse 30, and in Hebrew it's Vatahi Sarah Akara Ein La Valad, and what it means is now Sarai was barren; she had no child. Okay, why is that my favorite? because it's one of these verses that's so easy to read through. You're reading all these genealogies. You read about Terah and his sons and Avram, and he's married to Sarai, and then it just tucks this little thing. Oh, by the way, Avram's wife was barren. She had no child. So it's like, But then what we see next week with Lech Lecha, Genesis 12 and on, God tells Avram how he's going to make his name great and bless him, and all the nations of the world will be blessed through him. And in his seed, right, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And we're set up with this kind of a core mystery. It's a conflict. It's like, wait a minute. If Avram's wife is Akara, which is barren, and as a matter of fact, this is the prophet Isaiah. I think it's chapter 54 of Isaiah. He says, rejoice, O barren one, and be glad, you who have no children. And he uses this word Akara, and it's a play on Sarai as a picture of many things. One is Jerusalem, ultimately, because the idea is the new Jerusalem. Who are the children of God? Ultimately is the picture here. And that Sarai was not barren for any reason except for God's purpose, that at the right time, she would conceive a son by Abraham, who indeed would be the continuer of the covenant promise. And that would be Isaac, and he would be born of a miracle. And we can talk about this then when we get to those Torah portions about Isaac in the next few after this week. But we're set up. My point here is just that we're set up here at the end of Genesis 11 with this, hey, by the way, she's barren. Like, she ain't having a baby. But we know that means it's set up for miracle. It's set up to create. From last week's Torah portion, creation is already a miracle.
Well, and
creation is already a miracle. The salvation of Noah is a miracle. But now, how is God going to do this? How is God going to redeem the world back to the seed, especially when in the physical, in the flesh, it's impossible because Sarai can't have a baby.
So I want to go back for a few seconds. When I started in 8, right, chapter 8, we have this phrase, but God remembered. Vayizkor Elohim et Noach. God remembered Noah.
Nice Hebrew. Wow.
Hey.
See,
I have taken 3 years of Hebrew. No one would know it.
That was music to my ears, Caleb. Wow.
But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. Now, this is probably nothing, but I'll just see if you have a thread, because I thought, I wonder what other times where we see this same phrase in the Hebrew. So we see it 3 times in the entire Tanakh, and it's twice in Genesis, once in Exodus.
Vayizkor Elohim, or what?
Yeah. Vayizkor Elohim.
Yeah.
God remembered. So we have it obviously in our passage. Then we have Genesis 19:29.
Yes, yes.
God remembered Abraham and Lot, and sent Lot out of the midst and overthrew him. And then we have it again in Genesis 30:22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. Now that's interesting. Anyway, and then we have now. I understand completely that it's not Hebrew, but we have the phrase God remembered. We also have it in Revelation in the Greek, right? Mm-hmm. But this one is very different. Then the great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. So that's probably not a connection, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless that we switch in the end times to wrath instead of blessing. So blessing, 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 and then in the very end we have wrath. Any comments?
I love that connection. And you know what? It's worth pointing out too for maybe people who haven't thought about this, but the way the English that I grew up, if somebody remembered something, it means they forgot it.
Right.
And so it's like God remembered, like, oh, it's like, did he get busy? And he's like, oh, it's like, oh, I left the stove on, or,
Oh, there
and
you
all
are,
of
Rachel.
yeah. And all of a sudden he's like frantically, oh, I remembered, that like for some reason, that's the image that comes across with my English brain, but when I recall, when I consider that Zachar here, it has to do with covenant faithfulness. It doesn't mean he's forgotten. It doesn't imply absent-mindedness on the part of God at all. It has to do with God acting in history according to his covenantal purpose at the precise time, according to his own sovereign purpose and will and design. And so this remembering, it doesn't mean that, like you mentioned, the Genesis 19 occurrence with Sodom and Gomorrah, because Abraham had called out, right? He had interceded with God for if there had been any righteous to save the Sodom and Gomorrah, but God said, no, they're going to be destroyed, but we're going to save Lot. And so the memory there, God remembering, is meaning that the salvation of Lot and his daughters from Sodom and Gomorrah had a covenantal purpose with respect to God's covenant to Abraham. It wasn't an independent, like, oh, yeah, I guess, like, can you just do something nice for those guys too, just on the side? No, it had purpose. And we know that, in fact, even though it was this crazy situation where how these children were born to the two daughters of Lot, that indeed Ruth came from a Moabitess, right, who was of the line of Messiah. And then Rehoboam's mother was an Ammonite woman of Solomon's wife. So we have two threads of messianic lineage that we know from Matthew 1 through this line from Genesis 17 or Genesis 19 of God remembering. Okay. And then the other one you mentioned was Rachel. It wasn't like God, like, oh, oh, I forgot. Yeah. Like he did, oh, Rachel, I guess you could have kids too. No, there was a purpose. There was a purpose that God had closed her womb on purpose until a certain time.
Do
And
you think,
go ahead.
On that note, on the Rachel note, do you think that there is a little bit of a sense there that Joseph is the type, and I know that we have to be careful with types, but he's a type of the Messiah, right? We see the prophecy of the Messiah through and so the idea of God remembering Rachel is almost a foreshadow of God remembers his covenant.
It's beautiful, yeah, because Rachel's two children, of course, are Joseph, who becomes a shepherd and an interpreter of dreams. And we know that how he was treated and everything's very much a picture of the Messiah. However, the only son of Jacob born in the land is Benjamin. When they come back into the land, and Rachel dies and names him Ben-Oni, son of my affliction. So the only son whom Jacob names himself he says, no, his name's Benjamin. Well, guess what? Benjamin becomes such an important person of the brothers because he's instrumental in Judah standing up, being corrected from his sinful life, becoming a man to put his own life on the line for Benjamin, and owning up, and saying, with respect to all this, he didn't know. And I don't want to, we can talk about all this when we get there, but, he doesn't know Joseph as Joseph. Right. He knows him as a powerful leader just under Pharaoh in Egypt. And so, anyway, I even though there is that messianic sense of Joseph, there's also Rachel's two sons, Joseph and Benjamin, are absolutely instrumental in God shaping Judah, who of course becomes the kingly line.
I have several Hebrew questions for you. I figured that we could look at some of these. So I have it. So 9:20, Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. So I have a
Mhm.
note in the ESV that says it could be read, Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. But I am unclear on how the Hebrew would be translated that
They
way.
take the verb, for that first verb, vayachal, as in some places it can mean he began. Then they take, if you do that and Noah began, they
Right?
have to take the next vav hipuk, the vayita,
Yep.
as a purpose. He began to plant. So what are the other translations that you have there?
So, I mean, the translation and the way that I translated it when I first saw this was Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard.
Yeah. So what they did is the question is, if you say he began to be, the translations will, in English, will insert the verb to be. And Noah began as a ish ha'adamah, and
Right.
he planted a vineyard. So yeah, this verb vayachel here, vayachel technically is a strange one because it's used in our Torah portion where it says, "And men began to call upon the name of the Lord," and that was from Parashat Bereshit at the very end of chapter 5, which is a slightly different version there. They translate it, and man began to profane the name of God. So there's a difficulty with the root that has the chet and the lamed in it, whether it has to do with beginning or whether it has to do with
So
profaning.
they're like people might think that we're in the Hebrew weeds here, and maybe we are, and that's fine. The reason I bring it up is
We're in the
because
Hebrew vineyard that Noah
yes,
planted.
exactly. Well, actually, so the reason I bring this up is because my brain has been very much. I'm reading a lot on wine production in the Greco-Roman world, and
Yeah.
specifically from 600 BC all the way into about 300 AD, so I'm reading a fantastic book right now. I got done with a book that was on Roman symposiums and wine, and it was a shock to my sheltered system. And now I have moved over into Roman wine production during that time period in a fantastic book that I just picked up. And so I've been thinking about wine production and the formation of wine production. And so when we get to this passage, I see Noah already knows somehow he knows the in and outs of wine production. In other words, he creates a vineyard and it seems like he knows what he's doing. And this got my brain thinking about, well, okay, we've already talked about Cain and Abel in our last passage, and the fact that both of their offerings could be an offering in the temple, right? First fruits was something that you could bring to the temple and was commanded to be brought to the temple, right? The first fruits of was supposed to be offered to God. And then also the firstborn of your livestock is also supposed to be offered to God. So we're in the realm of offerings to God here. It seems to me like wine libations and or alcoholic libations, whether it's beer or whether it's wine or whether it's harder alcohol, right? We have the command: if you live too far, you can sell your offering and then take the money and buy whatever your hearts can desire, which would include strong drink, right? So that could probably be wine, some kind of alcoholic beverage. Anyway, so all of this got me thinking, well, at what point did God tell humankind what was an acceptable offering to him? And it seems to me, once again, this is coming from my own personal hypothesis, but I hypothesize that God actually gave it to them in the garden or when they were kicked out of the garden, what was an acceptable offering. So it seems to me like tilling the ground and all these things, which is supposed to be now harder because of sin, it seems like it's very plausible to me that God actually instills or teaches Adam and Eve the ability to till the ground, which would have included wine production and other production, right? I mean, I just right before we came on to record this, I was inside making bread, right? I'm starting my I'm starting my bread for the day so that I can bake later today, and then we'll have bread for Shabbat. And so it's like the idea of how much did God teach them? Well, I think that the Torah itself was given in the garden, and I also believe that the ability to produce from the ground, bread making, wine making, all these things, the staples of the human diet back in the day were given in the beginning. This is ultimately the reason that I was so interested with this idea of whether or not Noah was the first, right? Does 920 say that Noah was the first to be a vineyard, like a vintner, or was he just he began to till at this point for a vineyard?
I just double checked. I misspoke earlier. I said that verse was the end of chapter 5. It's at the end of chapter 4, where it says men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Some translations, men began to profane. But my point was with chapter 4 that I wanted to mention with respect to what you're talking about is that Cain is called an Oved Ha'adamah, a worker of the land.
The ground,
Noah here is called Ish Ha'adamah,
man of the ground.
A man of the ground. I like the translations that keep those separate, back to the 920, that he became an Ish Ha'adamah, and he planted a vineyard. What that means is the first verse is general. It doesn't mean all he did was like like all he did was bake bread or all he did was make wine. Right. No. The first says he understood, he had wisdom concerning all this kind of agricultural endeavor, but the vineyard is something probably that had a specialized attention, attention right. from him, and it's something that he really got into more intensely. It was like his special place, was the vineyard. But it doesn't mean he was ignorant of the others.
So I got another question, 3 verses later. Okay, now I need to explain my interpretation of this. In 923, and so let's read from 20. So Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on both their shoulders and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. Now, a lot of people, in fact, I just read a different book on wine, which I thought was trash. And this person decided to try to just kind of glance over this. I am personally, and you can correct me on this, but I'm becoming more and more convinced that the term Noah's nakedness is actually a reference to his wife. We see this, for instance, in the Torah. To uncover your father's nakedness, you're not allowed to sleep with your father's wife because it would uncover your father's nakedness, right? And we have this same kind of term over and over and over again. And so I'm becoming more and more convinced that actually what is happening here is that their mother is the one who's naked, and it's that it's referring to Noah's nakedness here. My question to you is...
Yeah, it's I am open to that understanding. It's a very clear way where the Bible says ervat, the nakedness of, is a way of, what do they call that? A euphemism, in a way, a euphemism. In other words, it's using delicate language. And the Torah doesn't always do this, but in this instance, I think that's a very plausible reading. Anyway, continue.
So in 23, the word nakedness, ervat, is in the feminine, and I'm wondering, is it in the?
It always is.
It's always in the feminine. So it's not erva at any point.
No, well, erva, that's in the construct. The fact that it's the tav there, but erva by itself is also feminine. So ervat, but so even if it was a male, it would still be
arva.
It's an abstract noun. But I think that this, we have to ask a question about Noah's anger and why he learned.
What's going on?
Why did he curse Ham and our Ham's son Canaan? What's going on here? And it seems to be that one of the things is him going out and I don't know if he was laughing or whatever. He didn't show honor or respect.
Or if he lusted.
Or discretion. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. I got another one for you, and then I'll essentially be done. 10:8, and I'll move there real quick. Sorry, 10:8. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. Gibor,
here we have that
right?
same, the hifil verb, that hechel, lichot gibor ba'aretz.
Right. So I'm wondering, this term, a mighty man, or yeah. I'm wondering if this is we read that and we think, okay, he's like some great dude. But I'm wondering if this is actually more of a title. In other words, a category of person. And I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it is.
And what would that category be?
Gibor, I don't have my accordance open right now, but you could go and just look at Gibor. It's leadership, a picture of strength, and authority.
But do you think it's a specific category for, like, in other words, the mighty men are in this category? In other words, it's not that everyone who is a great person is in that category, but that maybe that there's something unique about the term a mighty man here in our passage and in the rest of the Tanakh. Let me open this up. Keep going.
The very next verse, he was Gibor Tzayid Lifnei Adonai. Thus it was said, like Nimrod, Gibor Tzayid Lifnei Adonai. Like he had some sort of special giftings, in that set him apart to be named, like this.
My mind went to the discussions over the Nephilim, right? The Nephilim, so 6:4 is, we get this phrase too. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men. Giborim, right? The mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So, I'm wondering if we should see this more as a category of a specific kind of mighty man instead of just a mighty man. In other words, are there men who are great and renowned in the world who are not put into the category of Gibor?
Here's another. So that at the very end there, the men of renown, that Anshe Hashem, men of renown. The only other place we have that phrase. Now Gibor's not used there, but I believe is in number 16 when at Korah's rebellion, where Korah gathers up certain people from the tribe of Reuben, men of renown, and it says I think there's no definite article there. I think it says Anshe Shem, but it means like men of reputation, men who are popular for whatever reason, and have some sort of, charismatic sense that they're attractive for whatever reason, maybe by their strength, their kind of how they carry themselves. But that definitely
we see it a lot in Joshua. So Gibor, the mighty men or the men of valor, starts to really show up.
Like Gideon.
Joshua,
I think Gideon is called a Gibor. In other words, so some like to say this means giants because Gever means strong, strength,
or great,
but clearly, I think Gideon. If I'm right, I think Gideon is called a Gibor, and there are other Israelite heroes. Hero might be a way of translating it, kind of. It's tough. Translation is a rough sport.
So I mean that's all I have for this Torah portion. Was more questions for Rob's Hebrew brain, but clearly, I see. We talked last week a little bit about the idea of why we like God's almightiness and like the fact that he's created everything. So we have the beginning of the world, which is no small thing. In fact, I think it's some of the more difficult passages in the entire Torah. But at the same time, I see these all as setting up, right? Essentially, Genesis 1 through, 11 is when Avram comes in to the picture, right? But the first 11 chapters are kind of leading up to this character who is now going to take this idea of the seed that we see in 3 and carry it on. And so really we're starting, like now is when we're starting to get into the story, like into the actual like nitty gritty of the story. Not that the first 11 chapters aren't important, but it's almost like setting the stage, right? We're setting the scene up so that now all of a sudden from stage right comes Avram, right? And now we're going to start getting into a lot of the fun. Next week, we'll start getting into a lot of the fun, covenantal language and covenantal ideas, setting up these kind of things as well. And into really the story of what I would say is the coming Messiah, right? The story of the coming Messiah. So,
that's a good point. For a Gentile Christian believer who's new to the faith, they hear the gospel, they're like, yeah, wow, I love Yeshua. Where do I sign up? Like, what do I do? I'm all in. The curriculum starts us in the Torah, and it's like, oh, God created this world, right? Oh, God created this world with purpose. Do I believe in this family line? Does this genealogy matter? Well, yeah, the answer is yes, it matters. And it takes us from Seth all the way through Noah and Shem, all the way to Avram. And that's where the Gospel of Matthew begins, is with Abraham.
Right.
He says Yeshua is the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's the beginning of the New Testament.
Right.
And it's like, well, does that matter? Well, if we just say Abraham, we need Genesis 1 through 11 to set us up to understand the significance of Abraham. There are scholars that don't believe that Abraham ever existed, or that Noah ever existed, or that these are just made up fantasy stories, myths, to help a people kind of have a story to tell about themselves, to distinguish themselves from everyone else. Well, if you believe in Yeshua, then that worldview is at odds with the beauty and the coherence of God's revealed word and his purpose from the beginning. Luke has a genealogy that is organized very differently, goes all the way back to Adam. I think it's in Luke chapter 3.
Yep.
But Matthew 1 begins with Abraham and says, Abraham to David, 14 generations, David to the Babylonian exile, 14 generations, and then from the exile to the Messiah, 14 generations. And why does Matthew do that? Because he wants us to keep at the top of mind that this is not a plan B.
Right. Yes.
Messiah was not going to come in the time of the judges. He was not going to come in the time of the split kingdoms. He wasn't going to come in the time of the Babylonian exile. From the beginning, there was a time when the incarnation would actually, take place, and that redemption would be paid, et cetera, et cetera.
Love it. All right. We're going to cut it there. And I hope that this has been somewhat beneficial for you. I know that we got into some people are probably not going to like the nitty gritty of the Hebrew, but others are going to love it. So, but no matter what, I hope that it has benefited you and that you're able to dive even deeper into the Torah portion this week. We'll be back next week for another Torah portion, for our third Torah portion in the cycle, and we're going to keep doing this. I'm not sure, we'll probably have to take some time off throughout the year, but for the most part, every single week we will be here Fridays for Messiah Matters or for Moses Matters on that channel. And then, of course, you can also catch it. I believe it's going to be on the TorahResource YouTube channel as well on Shabbat. All right, everybody, thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.